Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Anthony Mohammed. He and I were sharing Michigan stories. Both I used to live in Michigan, and Anthony hails from Michigan. His talk is Moving the Bus Forward, Creating Healthy Learning Environments for All Students. And Anthony's background as a 20-year practitioner at middle and high schools is in professional learning communities. And many of us are familiar with professional learning communities, but the power of the PLC is something that Anthony is going to bring back this morning with regard to his remarks. His latest book, The Will to Lead, The Skill to Teach, Transforming Schools at an Entry Level, is available in our bookstore, but it is a text that I recommend to you because it talks about the power of PLCs and how the professional learning communities in schools can change the atmosphere and change the professional dynamic. And so, Anthony, we're happy to have you with us this morning. Please help me welcome Anthony Mohammed.
Good morning. Oh, I'm going to try that again. Good morning. I must not be in a state with the #1 basketball team in the country and a football team in first place. You sounded depressed. Try following the Michigan State Spartan football team and the Lions, and you'll be a little bit depressed. So, but it's a pleasure to be here with you. Wanted to congratulate the new State Superintendent of Instruction. Congratulations on your appointment. Whenever we go into public service, it's a weighty responsibility. And I'm looking at a group full of people, no matter what capacity you're in public service, whether you were elected or hired. And what makes our democracy great is that we hold our public officials to a very high standard because it's the lives of the individuals that you govern or you lead that gives us the mandate to lead. So she can't do the job by herself. She's going to need each and every one of you to contribute to moving Indiana forward and becoming a lighthouse and beacon for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And from hearing her remarks this morning, she sounds very humble, very passionate, very committed, and I wish her the best of luck in her new appointment. I also wanted to thank the University of Indianapolis and their young, dynamic president, we were joking about that a minute ago, and SEL for putting on this conference. But most of all, I want to thank you for your perseverance, your focus, and your dedication to the students here in Indiana. And I'm going to deal with some pretty touchy topics this morning. But I first wanted to thank you for your perseverance over a period of time that we've called school reform. And my argument is that the biggest casualty in the school reform movement has been common sense. Common sense has taken a huge hit over these last 10 years because we've had the interaction of many, many different ideas and sciences and agendas, and we really have lost a lot of what our focus is, which is on how do we help improve the lives of the students that we are trusted to lead. We've talked a lot about accountability and ratings and inter-rater reliability, and we've used all of this jargon. But in the midst of all of that jargon, what we've lost is our sense of passion and focus for the individual student. I've seen districts do some things over the past 8 to 10 years that are absolutely against what we say we're trying to do as a system. Encouraging students to drop out so that they won't mess up their state accountability scores. Moving district lines around so that the schools that we hope will make AYP make AYP. We've been in this kind of maze. And I hope that we can end the drama today and start a dialogue about what is our purpose as a system and what is our role in that particular system. Now, let me ask you a question. And I want to just put this in an ethical context. Have any of you ever held somebody else's newborn child? Anybody done that before? Yeah. I mean, that's that person's crown jewel, brand new baby. And they trust you to hold that baby in their arms. Let me ask you something. Are you really careful when you hold that newborn baby? Yes or no? Absolutely. Are you really cognizant of your movements to make sure that your movements don't harm the very tender and fragile baby? Is that what you do? Well, here in the state of Indiana, millions of families entrust not newborn anymore, but the same children that they allowed you to hold when they just came out of the womb. And that level of care has to go into serving their children the same way that you did when you held their newborn baby. So, my topic today deals with school culture. And how do we develop the environments that nurture student progress so that we have a state, a nation, and a world that is full of educated individuals who are ethical, who are skilled and focused, and we will owe that to what we call the public school system. Now, I want to start off with the public school purpose. I'm going to recommend several books to you over the course of this morning's keynote, and one I'd like to start off with is a book called Tinkering Towards Utopia. It's an excellent book, and in this book, the two authors kind of do a journey through the last 100 years of American public schools. And in that book, they basically narrow down the purpose of the American public school system based upon our reforms, our policies, legislation, court decisions, into two key purposes. And the number one purpose, if we ask ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing, is the belief that all children have the right to have their gifts and talents cultivated through a process that we call education. That it's a right. And if you look at a lot of the Supreme Court decisions in the 50s and 60s, and even in the 40s, the American Constitution does not mention education even one time. It wasn't considered something that was open to the public at the time of the framing of the Constitution. Education became essential as we moved into the 21st century, and the court system has ruled that every child has the right to have an education. It's not a privilege. It's mentioned under the liberty provision in the Declaration of Independence. So, looking at that first principle, I think we'd have to give ourselves a thumbs up for that, because I don't think that there's a student anywhere in the state of Indiana who doesn't have access to a public school. Now, it hasn't been without a fight. We've had Brown versus the Board of Education. We've had IDEA legislation and fighting for the rights of students with disabilities. But in 2012, I don't think at the top of your superintendent's agenda will be, how do we make sure that students get access to education? We get a thumbs up for that one. But it's the second characteristic that I want to spend a little time on. It's the belief that not just the children have the right to an educational institution, but that all children can and will learn. That we believe that no matter what zip code a person lives in, no matter how much pigmentation they have in their skin, no matter how much money their parents have in the bank, we believe in the principle of human potential. And that a school in Indianapolis should achieve at the same level as a school in southern Indiana. That all children, regardless of where they live in Indiana, should achieve at a certain level. So therefore, we develop things like state curriculums. We develop things like pacing guides and state assessments, because we're under the premise that no matter where a student lives or who a student is, that there are certain skills that every student has the ability to acquire and should acquire. And I think if we were honest, if we assessed ourselves on the second principle, nationwide, I think we say we've come up short. Because there are these things that we call achievement gaps. And you can predict them state to state along certain variables like income, disability, gender, race. These are issues that we haven't resolved over the course of the last 100 years that we are pushing people to resolve today. But my argument is our methodology is messing with our progress. So how do we get people on the bus, in the right seats, moving in the right direction, creating a culture that we can actually accomplish our objectives? Now, quick question for you. Have any of you over the past 8 to 10 years gotten any pressure to improve? It wasn't meant to be a joke, but it always gets a laugh. We live in the era of accountability, and 4 letters change the way that we measure school progress. Anybody heard of those letters? They mention those in Indiana every once in a while. N, C, L, and B. Anybody heard of that law here? I'm going to ask that again. Anybody ever heard of NCLB? Absolutely. NCLB has changed how we measure student progress. We used to be a very process-oriented profession. Now we're an outcomes-oriented. And some argue that's a good thing, some argue that's a bad thing. I'm not here to argue the merits of NCLB, but we have to admit NCLB has changed the landscape of how we measure progress. So, if we all laugh because we said that we've been pushed to get better results, according to Albert Einstein, what's the worst way to get better results? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So if we're going to get better results, guess what, Indiana? We're going to have to change. Can we all agree that change is not the easiest process for human beings? Can we agree with that? Yeah. We love change for everybody else. But change is not a process that we necessarily embrace. A book I'd like to recommend to you is a book called Change or Die. Well, the title sounds a little bit morbid, but it's a book written by a physician who had 6 very ill patients, and he was concerned about their well-being. He had all of their data, all of their tests, and he called each patient into his office, and he read them all of what Jim Collins would call their brutal facts. Their x-ray readings, their blood work, their cholesterol, their blood pressure. Some of them smoked, some of them drank, some of them didn't exercise, some were stressed out at work. And this physician pled with them. He said, listen, if you don't change your behavior, you're going to die. Can anybody guess what happened to all 6 of his patients? They died. So obviously this book isn't about medicine. The book is about the difficulty of the change process. If life itself, which is our most primal need, is not enough to motivate us to change, many of the things that we think motivate people to change are not motivators at all. They're actually demotivators. So if you think about the sanctity of our lives, hopefully you're enjoying the beginning of this keynote, but if somebody walked into this auditorium with a pistol and started randomly firing rounds, how many of you actually care about what my next slide looks like? That becomes instantly unimportant. So if life itself is not enough to motivate us to make critical changes, not making AYP might not be enough to motivate us to change. Not getting the right accountability rating might not be a good motivation to change. The motivational strategy built right into No Child Left Behind is the assumption that punishment equals change in behavior and improvement. And if you read just the first couple of chapters of Daniel Pink's book, Drive, you'll find out that punishment is by far the worst motivational strategy that we know of. So therefore, when we look at the Education Trust report in 2011 about school improvement, out of the schools in 2002 who were listed as failing schools under NCLB in 2002, by 2011, only 1% of those schools had gotten off of the failure list. So if NCLB was passed to help failing schools do better, given that record, punishment has not been a good incentive. Now let's flip to the Obama administration. The big initiative was Race to the Top. And what was the assumption? If punishment won't make you move, perhaps extrinsic motivation and incentives will make you move. Extrinsic motivation or incentives are almost as bad as punishment. When extrinsic motivations are what makes you move, there are 2 agreements that have to be made. Number 1, the person receiving the incentive has to view the incentive as valuable. So, if you want to bribe your child into taking out the garbage and you offer him $5, his motivation is based upon how valuable $5 is to him. So if it's not valuable, he won't do it. And secondly, it depends on the person who's given the incentive, their ability to continue to give the incentive. So when those 2 agreements aren't made, what we create is a sense of entitlement, where if I don't pay you or if I don't offer you something, then you won't do it. So unfortunately, if we look at our history of reform, we have chosen the 2 worst strategies that we could think of to motivate people to move out of their comfort zone and therefore develop the type of schools that we like to get. So change is difficult. And as change is difficult at an individual level, I want you to think about how difficult change is at an organizational level. We may have some folks here from Indianapolis, I think, which is the largest district in the state of Indiana. Second largest. You're looking at thousands of employees. If it's hard to change one person, if it's hard to give up chocolate cake, hard to give up something individually, imagine trying to change thousands of people simultaneously. Organizational change, I like to call change on steroids. It's change squared, cubed, etc. I mean, it goes into the infinite. So when we look at organizational change, there are two primary forms. The first form we call technical, and some researchers have referred to this as structural change. Technical or structural change pertains to the non-human aspects of changing the organization. Common Core is a technical change. The new teacher evaluation system is a technical change. Moving from a 6-period day to a block schedule is a technical change. We do need good technical changes. We need better curricula. We need better systems. We need better structures. No doubt about it. Necessary. But the second type we refer to as cultural change. And cultural change deals with changing people's beliefs, attitudes, assumptions, and behaviors. Now, based upon your experience working in schools, which one have you found to be the most difficult? Technical or cultural? Cultural. It's not even close. Larry Lazat, who's one of my heroes, put it like this. I love the blunt manner that he wrote it. Dr. Lazat wrote that culture eats structure for breakfast. You can change the structure all day long. If the culture does not change or evolve to embrace the structure, the culture will eat the structure for breakfast. Now, I'm a student of organizational theory, kind of a geek. I love Max Weber, go figure. I love John Dewey, and they didn't agree on a whole lot. But what they did agree on is that progressive organizations, if we look at a linear and sequential order, address their culture first. And once they've developed a healthy culture, they develop the tools, techniques, and structures necessary to be congruent with their culture. In education, what's always been our sequential order when it comes to technical and cultural change? Which one has always come first? Talk to me. Which one? Technical. Our history has been we change the structure or we change the tool, and then we cross our fingers and hope that the new structure or the new tool will change people's beliefs, attitudes, theories, assumptions, and behaviors. And our innovations, if we look at it honestly, have been miserable failures. And that was the conclusion of tinkering towards utopia. Think of all of these structural innovations we've tried over the last 50 years. Who remembers the open schools movement? Remember that? Schools with no walls? Yeah. And I grew up in Flint, Michigan, and they built a school called Flint Open School. And it was a round school with no walls. Guess what they had contractors in there doing about 6 months after it's open? Putting up drywall. We've tried small learning communities. We've tried big learning communities. We've tried middle school concept. We've tried junior high concept. We've tried K-8. And if you go class to class, what you find is very little has changed in the nature of teacher-student relationship and the educational progress. My mentor, Rick DeFore, likes to call it rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. That's been our history in educational reform. I think that we can do better than that. Now, as the gentleman mentioned, I have a new book called The Will to Lead, The Skill to Teach. It was actually launched last November right here in Indianapolis at an event called Author Speak. And I co-wrote that book with a gentleman named Dr. Shiraki Holly, who's a brilliant pedagogical specialist. He's a professor at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And his area of focus is in the area of culturally responsive teaching and learning. And he's brilliant in that area. I don't know anybody who's better. And our theory is this. If a school is going to meet the promise of the American school system, that a school needs a balance of culture, meaning the will, the environment, and the right activities and structure. So our theory is it's a connection of learning environment and learning practices or teaching practices that make what we call a powerful school. It's a balance of two. We've had an imbalance, and that's what we theorize has caused a lot of the issues that we have. Now, we've created or identified 4 zones of operations in 4 different quadrants. The quadrant that we're encouraging every school in America to reach for, and I thought we've done a pretty good job of identifying what these schools look like, we call it the high will, high skill zone. This is a place where educators are highly synergized, highly aligned, they're focused on student success, but they also have the skills, the tools, the resources, and the knowledge necessary to develop students properly academically. Now, by show of hands, how many of you have children of your own? Can I see a show of hands? How many of you would love to send your children to a school where the educators in that school cared about your child's success as deeply as you do? And they have the resources, the structure, the knowledge, and the skills necessary to properly educate your child in the way that he or she learns best, where they don't have to lose their cultural identity and they leave an affirmed human being. Who'd like to send your child to a school like that? That's the zone that we want every school in America to reach for. But there are 3 other zones that we like for you to encourage you to stay out of. Let's start with the upper left-hand corner. We call this school the high will, low skill school, or what I like to call the Kumbaya University. This is where people are very concerned about students. They affirm them culturally. They feel good about themselves, but they can't read well. The instruction is at a very low level. I typically, when I do school culture audits, people refer to those students in these schools as their babies. Well, there's a high level of affinity, a high level of nurturing, but the rigor to go along with the nurturing isn't there. I don't quite think that's what we're shooting for. Nurturing is a great thing, but not in absence of academic skill development. Bottom left-hand corner, the high skill, low will zone, or what we like to call the Charles Darwin Senior High School of Natural Selection. This is a place where people are highly skilled, all of the educational jargon. They're very skilled in the curriculum. They're at the cutting edge, but they don't think it's their role or responsibility to nurture, develop, or inspire students into what they teach. That learning is an obstacle course. And those species that are strong enough and adaptable enough will earn that knowledge, and those who aren't become the casualties of a process called evolution. And last and certainly least, the bottom right-hand corner, the low skill, low will zone. I'm from Detroit, and we call this school, I don't know if you use this vernacular here in Indianapolis, see if it resonates. We call this school a hot mess. You know what a hot mess is? This is a place where nobody cares and nobody knows what to do. What the Obama administration is calling a dropout factory. A very depressing activity for the children, a very depressing activity for the educators, where people just survive on a daily basis, and it is a waste of people's time and taxpayers' dollars. I'd like for you to take 1 or 2 minutes and talk to your neighbors. If you had to place your school on this continuum in a quadrant, which quadrant would most accurately describe your school or your district if you had to assess where your school is on this continuum right now? What would most accurately describe where you are? Obviously, a minute and a half is not enough for you to totally assess where you are. I just wanted to whet your appetite and do a little reflection on where do you think you are. And here's the good news. Wherever you are, there's a saying we use, it is what it is. One of the things that Dr. Martin Luther King said that doesn't get repeated as much as other quotes is that Dr. King said, he asked a question, what's the first thing that needs to be done when the lights go out? It's acknowledgement that the lights are out. Because if you don't acknowledge that the lights are out, you can't develop a plan to turn the lights back on. So if there are parts of your organization which aren't operating at an optimal level, it doesn't make you a bad superintendent or a bad principal or a bad school leader. It means that there's development that needs to happen, and you have the foresight to pinpoint where it is and organize your resources to start to attack those issues. So my job is not here to judge people, rank people, condemn people. My job is to help you wherever you are to move to where we say every school should be. And some people are closer to that model than others, but we know what to do to get people there. Now, my contribution to this work is in the area of school culture. And I've written 2 books on school culture, and it's my passion. And some of you may be thinking, well, Dr. Muhammad, what is school culture? Kent Peterson, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin, who I have a great deal of respect for, has given us what we consider the operationalized or universally accepted definition of school culture. According to Peterson, what is school culture? School culture, according to Peterson, is a school set of norms, values and beliefs, rituals and ceremonies, symbols and stories that makes up what Peterson describes as the persona of the school. That's pretty multifaceted. School culture is more than morale. It's more than rituals. It's more than traditions. It's all of that stuff wrapped into one. I like to describe school culture through 5 different disciplines. It's a mix of anthropology, sociology, psychology, political science, and history. So when I became a principal, I had no clue that I was walking into such a complex organization. And why is the organization complex? Because the organization is made up of human beings, and human beings are complex. What's really been kind of perplexing in this whole school reform movement is that we've pretty much taken the human element out of our discussion. That we're driving people over a cliff because we haven't had the discipline to understand and study that schools aren't buildings. Schools aren't accountability ratings. All schools are a collection of human beings involved in hundreds and thousands of interpersonal relationships. If we don't take the time to examine that through a methodical and pragmatic lens, no wonder only 1% of the schools on the failing list have gotten off since 2002. Now, I like to describe school culture like this, to make it plain for you. I like to describe school culture like soil and technical change like seeds. Do any of you in this audience have a garden? Do we have any gardeners here? Okay. How important is soil to your garden, gardeners? It's not that important. Let me ask you again. How important is soil to your garden? Very important. Now, you can go to the farmer's market and you can purchase the best seeds that money can buy. I'm talking about top of the line seeds. And we have a lot of good ones. If you bring that seed back to your garden and you plant it in soil that's dry, acidic, and uncultivated, what's likely to happen to that seed? Nothing. It won't grow. It won't germinate. It won't give you the produce you expect, not because it was a bad seed. It wasn't planted in the right environment. If you took that same seed and planted it in soil that was hydrated, minerally rich, and properly cultivated, what's likely to happen to the exact same seed? It's going to grow, flourish, and give you the produce you expect. So, if some of you work in districts with several schools, have you ever seen a school reform initiative that blossomed and was a great success in one school, but floundered and was a huge failure in another school? That had nothing to do with the validity of the initiative. It had everything to do with the environment that initiative was implemented. So wouldn't it make sense for us, with all of these research-based, data-driven strategies, that we spend a lot of time trying to develop the magic seed that can transcend bad soil? So here's a question I've been asking politicians for the last 3 to 5 years. If we really want to see schools improve, why have we invested so much in the seed and so little in the soil? We spend time and money trying to evaluate the teacher rather than spending time and money trying to cultivate the teacher. We spend so much time trying to evaluate the school rather than spending time and energy trying to cultivate the school. If the human capital is developed, there are a lot of great strategies that will work. Charlotte Danielson's framework is a great framework. Marzano's framework is a great framework. But I will guarantee you, if the culture is not conducive or does not embrace that, it will eat that strategy for breakfast. I've never found a strategy that can transcend bad culture. So, I want to give you a few tools to help you with your garden. So if your soil is a little bit dry, there's a few weeds in it, I want to give you what we know about developing the soil so that the great strategies developed at the state level, the federal level, and the local level will actually work. You're going to get this presentation, I think, on the website, but when you get it and you print it, I want you to circle this slide. It's called a healthy school culture. This is that good soil. This is where the ideas of the new state superintendent will actually work, where the ideas of the State Board of Education will work. This is that rich soil. Peterson describes it as a healthy school culture. And what does it look like? It's a place where educators have an unwavering belief in the ability of all of their students to achieve success, and they pass that belief to others in overt and covert ways. To stop right there. The first level of alignment in the development of a healthy school culture is an agreement, philosophically, that every child that we serve can and should be successful. I would dare say that that hasn't been developed in every school in America. In the book that was mentioned, I have a section on what I call dangerous synonyms. When we use terms like urban, we change the scale. When we use terms like high poverty, we change the scale. We've used all children as propaganda, as dogma, but we haven't truly embraced the fact that all children can be successful. And it starts with the belief that they can be successful. And it doesn't jibe with politics. It's sad that real estate values are somewhat calculated on test scores for certain communities. And then boards of education buy into that. And the superintendent has to serve that agenda. So inequality is something that is a reality. In order to be a healthy culture, according to Peterson, there has to be a universal belief that every child that you serve has the capacity to learn and master the standards when taught the way that they learn best and given enough time to learn. But there are some kids who start with strikes against them before they even walk into the school, based upon what neighborhood they live in, based upon the history of the school, based upon whether they have a disability, what language they speak at home. So, I want to ask you to take on the big task, and I've written about it extensively, what I call the elephants in the room. Think about that analogy, elephant in the room. What if that was literal? What if there was literally an elephant in this room and we all acted like we didn't see it? Would this be a tough keynote to attend? With a 5,000-pound elephant in the middle of the room, everybody's doing like this? The elephant in our room, when I was a principal in the Detroit area, was race. My school was 98% African American. The problem wasn't that my school was 98% African American. The problem was what my staff's level of expectations were based upon the level of pigmentation in our student skin. And once we could deal with that, we could get into PLC. We could get into the strategies. What are the elephants in your room? Are there kids that we can predict won't do as well as other kids? Because Peterson's definitions doesn't say believe in the ability of most students. It says all. Now, Peterson's definition doesn't stop with belief. It moves forward into action. And Peterson writes that in these environments, educators create policies, procedures, and practices that support their belief in the ability of every student. So to be a healthy culture, what we say we believe has to be supported by how we behave, by our instructional practices, by our discipline policies, by our placement and zoning procedures, due process for students. No sane organization says one thing and then their policies, procedures, and practices do something else. That's what we call a healthy culture. Now, I've had the pleasure now to study now over 400 schools in this area of school culture. And in studying healthy culture, there are 3 indisputable components that I found that every single healthy culture developed. So you say, where do we start, Dr. Muhammad? The first key ingredient in developing healthy culture is developing universal focus and commitment. Larry Lazat, who I mentioned earlier, who I'm a big fan of, wrote that you can't hold people accountable for what you haven't made explicit. And that's been difficult for us because schools traditionally have been individualized enterprises. When I started as a teacher, my principal walked me to my classroom, room 225, handed me my keys. handed me a cart of books, shook my hand, and told me good luck. Anybody have an experience like that? I was doing a talk in Florida, and a teacher said, well, at least your principal walked you to your classroom. So I guess it could get worse. And I worked in a middle school with 61 other teachers. I was never taught to care about what the other 61 teachers were doing. I was socialized professionally in a me mentality. My students, my classroom, my objectives. So to develop a healthy organization, we're going to depend on you as leaders to transition people from a me mentality to a we mentality. And that's difficult for us because of years of being socialized in a me mentality. So the healthy cultures I've had the privilege to study, when you walk in, you don't have to guess what their purpose is. You see it in their policies, their procedures, their language. You see it in their symbols. They are united on a common purpose. Now, let me ask you a question. Is setting a goal enough to improve? Let me ask you that again. Is setting a goal enough to improve? No. It gives you a good start. And January 1st, all around America, American citizens make commitments and goals. Anybody know what those are called? New Year's resolutions. And according to USA Today, what's the number one New Year's resolution of American citizens? Lose weight. So you lie to yourself every year too, huh? So let's say January 1st, I make the commitment to lose 15 pounds by May 1st. That's my New Year's resolution. Is that commitment alone enough to improve? No. But without the commitment, it won't guide my behavior. I know what my target is. I've made an explicit commitment. Now I have to do what? Change my behavior. So I have to change my exercise regimen, have to change my diet. And does it make sense that periodically along the journey, I should take a moment periodically to seek some data to give me some objective feedback on the process? Does that make sense? What tool should I use to give me objective feedback on the quality of my program or how close I'm getting to my goal? Scale. So, February 15th, I want to weigh myself for the first time. I'm going to do an assessment. Get on the scale. I'm excited. I think I've been working really hard. And the scale tells me I've lost 1 pound. Does it make good sense to attack the scale? Stupid scale, bam! And I keep finding scales till it tells me what I want to hear. So please take note of this. In healthy cultures, data is not used for coronation or condemnation. Data is used as information. If there is a true commitment to the goal, then people will seek feedback on their progress towards the goal. So in a healthy culture, there is no such thing as good or bad data. In education, what have we traditionally done? We don't like what the feedback is from a measurement tool. We've typically attacked the tool. Stupid tool. Instead of using the feedback from the tool to fuel our behavior towards reaching the goal. So how is that manifestation that I've lost 1 pound, how does that help me? How is that helpful to me? Should I just go sulk? How is, after 6 weeks, finding out I only lost 1 pound, how is that feedback helpful to me? It gives me guidance that my program isn't working. So, maybe that 4 minutes a day on the treadmill wasn't enough. Maybe cutting my Twinkie consumption from 5 to 4 a day wasn't enough. So, objective feedback helps fuel improvement, and we move from being reflective to what I call prescriptive. Jim Collins calls it discipline practice. Rick and Becky DeFore call it collaboration. So, healthy cultures move from a shared commitment to shared action, to shared measurement of that action, and shared adjustment based upon it. And what's really unique and cool about the assessment of these schools is that it was so ingrained, it became habits. I would ask them, why do you do this? Why do you do? I don't know, we've always done that. Wouldn't it be cool to have thousands of people operating off of this paradigm? A commitment to a unified goal, the willingness to experiment, to analyze the results of those experiments and make adjustments. You wouldn't need heavy-handed state regulation if this was the culture. We wouldn't need federal intervention if this was the culture. And the people who are most accountable And the most capable of developing this are right in the room. Now, when you get your hand out, I want you to put an X through this slide. It's called a toxic school culture. This is a place where innovation finds its graveyard. According to Peterson, a toxic culture is a place where educators believe that student success is based upon a student's level of concern, attentiveness, prior knowledge, and willingness to comply with the demands of school, and they pass that belief to others in overt and covert ways. A stop. Just like in a healthy culture, a toxic culture develops a universal belief system that success is possible if students care, they're attentive, they have background knowledge, and they do everything that they're told. Let me ask you a quick question. Any of you in this audience have any students in your school district who don't care, don't pay attention, don't have background knowledge, and don't comply? Can I see a show of hands? So in a toxic culture, what is the message that's sent to students who don't have those characteristics already developed? That you're a failure, and this is why. So, in a toxic culture, I like to call them descriptive and deflective. Now, when we talk about these characters, have any of you ever worked with individuals who find new and creative ways to complain about the same thing over and over again? This is a characteristic or habit of a toxic culture. I got into an argument with a colleague of mine when I was a teacher. I asked him, how many different ways can you say parents don't care? I heard you last year. I heard you the year before. I heard you last week. Do you think I didn't understand you? Or my English was rusty? I got it. There is something therapeutic in a toxic culture about repeating the nature of their problems over and over again. And when it comes time to assign responsibility for fixing the problem, in a toxic culture, guess who never takes responsibility? Those who are doing the describing. So, I don't want anybody to get confused. My work is not about good versus evil, right versus wrong. My work is about productive organizational behavior versus unproductive. So if anybody has on an emotional hat, I'm going to ask you to set it to the side for a minute and put on your rational, pragmatic hat. Given a set of problems, do you think it's more productive to reflect on your problem and work together to resolve the problem? Or do you think it's better to describe the problem repeatedly and find other people to associate blame for the problem? If we have our rational hat on, we would agree that the first set of strategies are more productive than the second set. Not good, bad, right, wrong. Productive versus unproductive. Now, I want to spend just a few more minutes kind of diving into the root of how toxic cultures develop and what we need to do to develop them into healthy culture. I've just described it to you thus far. The root of a toxic culture, and I want to make sure that I address the new wonderful state superintendent. The root of a toxic culture I've discovered is frustration. That frustration is the kryptonite to healthy culture. That the higher the level of frustration, the higher the toxicity. Now, my theory is the number one responsibility of a leader is to increase productivity. When we talk about productivity with students, we're talking about developing character, academic knowledge. What a great area to increase productivity. I found, and I've developed a tool with Dr. Peterson, where we'll do an assessment and give you some feedback on where your frustration lies. And we can show you that the higher the level of frustration in your organization, the lower the productivity. So the principle is a highly frustrated staff is a highly unproductive staff. So what is frustration? According to Webster, frustration is a feeling of anxiety as the result of the inability to accomplish a task. So, do any of you feel really empowered when you get frustrated? Say, man, I can't wait to get frustrated. I'll knock it out of the park when I get frustrated. This is when we lose our keys, we lock the door, lock ourselves out. Frustration is not a very admirable psychological state, but it's a natural human response. So, I have a plane to catch to Los Angeles when I leave here. That's my goal. If due to traffic or some unforeseen circumstance, I don't make my flight, what do you expect to emerge from me naturally as a human being? I'll probably get what? Frustrated. That doesn't make me a bad consultant, doesn't make me a bad father, doesn't make me a bad husband. It means I'm human. The more frustrated I am, the more unproductive I am. Now, let's move to the other side of this frustration equation. Let's look at some sociology. What is the typical migratory pattern of a group of individuals in an organizational environment when they get highly frustrated? How do people tend to migrate? They gravitate towards other people who share the common frustration and develop toxic subcultures or cliques. Why do we develop subcultures? Because we're not getting what we need from the greater culture. So people develop informal organizations to help themselves cope with what they're collectively frustrated by. So, let me give you a description of the worst cultures that I've studied. They're like two kindergartners in timeout. The teachers are in that corner pouting, pointing fingers at the administration, who's in that corner pouting, pointing fingers at the teachers. I go interview teachers and ask them, why are you so angry, adversarial, and combative with your leadership? They'll give me 15 indictments on the leadership. They don't communicate. We're always changing directions. He's never in the building. They'll give me a long list. I go investigate those indictments, and guess what I'll find? They're all true. He is just as flawed as they said he is. Go talk to the administration and ask them, why are you all so angry, adversarial, and combative with your teachers? They'll give me 15 indictments on the teachers. They don't know the Common Core. They don't do common assessments. They don't use their collaborative time right. And when I investigate, guess what I find? They're all true. Both parties are spending so much time describing the faults of others and deflecting blame for the lack of motion that what they've missed is they become stagnant, and in some cases, they've gone backwards. Here's a huge transition I'm going to ask you to consider. If you truly want to develop a healthy culture, a couple of principles to remember. Human beings are flawed. The same flaws you see in others, they see in you. I'm going to ask you to call a timeout and meet in the center of the room and stop fighting one another. And this is the analogy I like to use. I'm going to ask you to turn your window into a mirror. Anybody can look out of a transparent piece of glass and describe everything that they see that's wrong with the outside world. It takes much more discipline to turn that transparent piece of glass into a reflective piece of glass and put ourselves under the same level of scrutiny that we put other people under. So I'm working with staffs all over the country on this premise. Put your big boy and big girl pants on. Let's meet in the center of the room. Let's stop fighting one another, and let's start to develop shared commitment, shared experimentation, shared reflection, and shared movement, rather than describing and deflecting each other's faults, because we're both frustrated and we're leaning on a bad set of coping mechanisms to deal with it. Now, why might teachers get frustrated? Just real quick, because I'm working with leadership who become the primary reason why teachers are frustrated. In my new book, I call it The Recipe for Disaster. It's amazing we have as many healthy cultures as we do. Think about the conditions we put teachers in. Let's say a young lady just graduates from the University of Indianapolis. Okay? She gets her first teaching job in Richmond. Okay? And barely passes the state chemistry test. And we put her in a classroom. Can we all agree that there is no university, no matter how great, that can totally prepare us for all of the things that we encounter and experience as new teachers? Can we agree with that? I didn't have dramatic teammate 312. I didn't have budget cut 415. I didn't have combative parent 219. There are things I wasn't prepared for. So we bring this young lady into this environment, and what do? We sit her right next door to the queen of chemistry, who's been teaching chemistry for 27 years, has a specialist degree, nationally board certified. She's been a 3-time district teacher of the year, and she doesn't share her material with anybody. And now, under a new accountability system with evaluation, we're expecting that first-year teacher to produce the same outcome as the 27-year queen of chemistry. And then we wonder why people are frustrated. Now, not only do we come in underprepared, oftentimes we inherit a support system that doesn't plug in the gaps and oftentimes is not very responsive. And then last but not least, the first two are bad enough. Then we add task overload. What do you expect to happen to a group of people who are underprepared, undersupported, and you give them too much to do? Would it be hard to predict that they may get highly frustrated? And there's a huge disconnect between those who are making policies and making decisions and those in the field who are actually implementing it. And we're kind of rearranging the data. But go visit some schools sometime and just walk through the halls. Listen to the conversation. There are many educators who are right on the brink because they're so frustrated. Now, to make a long story real short as I start to wrap this up, healthy cultures collectively become groups of problem solvers, and toxic cultures become groups of complainers. Hopefully we can agree collectively working together to solve problems is a paradigm and a trajectory that we can embrace, and if that's our mindset, new ideas will work. But if complaining becomes our coping mechanism for high frustration, no matter what law passes or what tool is passed down, it won't work. Now, I want to give you a picture of what this looks like as I close. How many of you are familiar with Jim Collins? Okay. Good to Great, Built to Last, How the Mighty Fall. One of my favorite business authors. Collins did a study to write a book called Good to Great. And he wanted to find out what separated great companies from mediocre average companies. I did a study of 34 schools in the book Transforming School Culture, and my question was, what separates a healthy school culture from a toxic school culture? And what I found was, it was a difference in habits. Some of my findings correlated with Collins' findings. This is what we found. Collins wrote that great companies, without exception, sought and confronted what he called brutal facts. And what are brutal facts? They're problems. Everybody has problems. Now, why would a great organization spend time and resources trying to strategically pinpoint where they're flawed? Because it's a mindset that we can't improve if we're not clear about where we're flawed and we don't use our resources to solve that. What I found was schools, by and large, get a thumbs up for this first principle. In 2012, can we admit that we're more data-driven today than we've ever been? We agree with that? Yeah. You can tell me your AYP status, your strands that kids are working on, how many points you are from being exemplary. I mean, we're good at that. And if you don't seek your brutal facts, the state office doesn't have a problem sending you a whole report full of them. So we don't suffer from brutal fact amnesia. We're good there. It was the next characteristic where we fell apart. Collins wrote that great organizations get the right people on the bus, in the right seats, moving in the right direction. Now, what's the bus? The bus is a metaphor for technical change. So, if Einstein said insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result, when we don't like a result, that means we have to move quickly into a new policy, practice, or procedure to help attack the brutal fact. Our issue in education isn't a lack of buses, isn't a lack of knowing brutal facts, it's getting people on the bus, in the right seats, moving in the right direction. So, I want you to think about something. In your school, how long does it take people to move from talking about a problem to collaborating collectively to work on a problem? If there's a great distance between problem identification and experimentation, I call that gap adult drama. Anybody ever dealt with any adult drama? What's adult drama as I close? Adult drama is dysfunctional social interactions between adult professionals within a school environment which interferes with the proper implementation of better policies, procedures, and practices. I work with districts who have so many buses it looks like a bus terminal. All of these programs with nobody on the bus. It's the dysfunctional social interactions that prevent people from getting on the bus. In the breakout session, I'm going to give you insight on how we get people on that bus. So, as I close, I want to ask you one question. How many of you would love to work in an environment where whenever problems are identified, the only response of your colleagues would be this: what do I need to contribute to help solve it? Who'd like to work in a place like that? Wouldn't that be cool? You know what that's called? It's called a healthy culture. And later on, I'll give you some more insight on how to develop it. Thanks for having me. God bless you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.